I and my father were working doing drywall in Boynton Beach, Florida. We had just finished a job and came back into the office for a new assignment. Frank told us that he had a, quote, special job and he would consider it a favor if we would do it. The developer of Boca Chica had a couple of hunting cabins in the Everglades, and it wouldn't take us more than a couple of days. We would have to camp there overnight since it was too far to drive and there wasn't any lodging around. Now, my wife was over 7 months pregnant, and I wasn't crazy about doing the job. However, Frank was persuasive. If you want to continue working for me, you'll do it. I didn't have health insurance, and I was making payments to Bethesda Hospital in advance for my wife's upcoming hospital stay. So I caved in and took the job. The next day, we packed up some camping gear in the station wagon. My idea of camping was a state park or a KOA camp. So we set off. The directions were simple. Take the Florida Turnpike south and go west on Alligator Alley. About halfway across, you'll see a gravel road to the left. Pass it and take the next gravel road to the left. The work site would be halfway between Alligator Alley and the Tamiami Trail. Looking back, I would say this would have put us in Collier County, Florida, at the beginning of the Everglades. We traveled for miles and miles under the hot sun on Alligator Alley, and for what seemed miles and miles of miles and miles. Coming to the second gravel road, we turned left and traveled more miles and miles down a washboard gravel road. I had packed some fishing gear and a .22 caliber Magnum pistol with a holster and two .30 caliber M1 carbines. A canal ran parallel to the road, and I had at least wanted to get my hook wet. So I talked him into stopping for about 15 minutes or so to stretch our legs, and I dropped a line into the canal. It was full of alligator gar, and they were stacked up like cordwood. My father spotted a water moccasin on the bank, and I took out my .22 Magnum and aimed it behind the head, and shot its head clean off. We started up again and went many more miles until we saw a sign for the site. We arrived in the early afternoon. The two cottages turned out to be two houses, each identical and 2 stories high. The developers had a drive made by dumping a pad of coarse gravel about 2.5 to 3 feet high, about 300 yards back into the swamp. At the end and right of each drive was a big square of gravel the houses were built on. This was going to be more than a 2-day job. We started taping the houses. While I was working, I could hear something rummaging around out in the bush. I couldn't see anything, but there was a strong odor, similar to a pig farm next to my grandfather's house in Ohio. The area was known to have wild boar, so I just assumed that's what it was. We worked until dark and cleaned up and packed up our tools. I had Dad start a campfire on the part of the drive that went past the house. I set up our cots and put on my holster with my .22 just in case the boars decided to charge us. Dad decided to start cooking a slab of bacon. One thing about Dad, he's a master chef when it comes to rough grub. We ate bacon and beans and home fries and sat around the fire talking. The whole time I kept hearing the rummaging around in the Everglades. The sound seemed to be getting near. It occurred to me that if it were a wild boar or anything as large as the sounds indicated, the .22 Magnum I was carrying wouldn't be too effective. So I decided to go get one of the carbines. As I stood up and started to go to the wagon, I turned around to see 2 eyes staring about 20 feet away. At first I thought it was an owl, but then I realized what I was looking at, and I froze in my tracks. Next thought, it had to be a bear. Only I was staring level at its eyes. It was on a gravel pad about 2.5 to 3 feet higher than I was. I'm 5 foot 6 inches. My God, this thing had to be at least 8 to 9 feet tall. My hand went for my gun. I drew it and I was going to fire. Only I realized that if I shot this thing, I was only going to piss it off. Also, it wasn't acting threatening. It was just watching. It had a face more like a human than a bear or an ape, much closer to an Australian Aboriginal. I could also see its skin. It didn't have thick fur. The hair was sparse with long and wispy-like strands. The hair was more like an orangutan. Only these things I would put together later. At the time, I was just plain scared. As a Vietnam veteran with a Purple Heart, I wasn't over-scared either. Let's just say I had a strong sense of self-preservation. I made a beeline for the house and momentarily thought about stopping to get the carbine from the wagon. However, my feet took me into the house and up the stairwell. My dad was hot on my heels. I went to the window which faced the campfire. As I looked out the window, I asked Dad, who was across the room. "Did you see that?" He said, "No." I said, "Then what the heck are you running for?" He said, "I saw you draw your gun and then didn't shoot and then run off. I figured you had a good reason." I told him, "We need the carbines. You got to go out there and get them, and I'll cover you." But he wouldn't do it. Still looking out the window, I noticed that we'd left a slab of bacon on a log near the campfire. Then I saw it come out of the brush. I told Dad, "There it is. Come over here and look at it." But he wouldn't do it. I don't know if he could have got across the room in time anyway. It crossed into the viewable area maybe 100 feet in just a few strides. As it walked, it scooped up the slab of bacon. It didn't really bend over. It just dropped one shoulder slightly. It was walking upright the whole time. I might add, it was walking, not running. It was casually strolling as if it didn't have a care in the world. It dawned on me that this thing didn't mean any harm. It just wanted the bacon. Anyway, I went to the wagon and got the carbines. Even though I wasn't sure what I saw, and I concluded that it didn't mean any harm, I wasn't taking any chances. I told Dad that we were going to take 2-hour watches. He decided to sleep first. I woke him up in 2 hours and told him to awake me in another 2 hours. I woke up in the morning and he was fast asleep. Whatever it was could have had us, if it wanted to. The doors had not even been installed on the cabins yet. I went out and looked for tracks. Nothing on the gravel. I didn't expect any. I climbed down onto the ground. I thought it would be soft, but it was dry and there was a thick pad of pine needles. There were a few scruffed places, but the distance between them looked way too far to be footsteps. I thought about venturing out to look for the soft spot, but at the time I wasn't trying to prove anything but to myself. If my dad hadn't been such a chicken and had seen it, then I would be more resolved to look further. Only now I was beginning to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. I really didn't make the connection until a few weeks later after I came home and there was a newspaper article about Sasquatch sightings in the area I had been in. I just made a mental note to ask if any circus or zoo animals had escaped in that area, and if so, I would call and tell them what I saw. I'm not relating this encounter to make you a true believer. At the time, I know I saw something, and this is a report on what I thought I saw. After 28 years now, I question it myself. The more the time passes, the sketchier the recollection is. I only offer this record in hopes that it might help those who are seriously looking for it. I have one reservation. If this creature is real, and it is found, will that doom it to extinction? Man calls police after stumbling upon a sleeping Sasquatch in the brush behind his home. I had been helping some neighbors with a repair, and since I don't drive anymore, they took me home. It was about 2 p.m. on December 26, 2012. The car had several people in it when they dropped me off. I was up on my porch getting my keys out to open the front door when I heard screaming coming from the car that was still in the driveway. Wondering what they were arguing about, I turned to look at them. And I saw that they were frantic, pointing to the back of my yard. I turned to look to see what they were pointing at, and when I saw a very large, hairy, upright form crossing a little cut in the brush at the back of my lot. There were 3 deer with it, 2 in front and 1 behind. That seemed strange. The deer were unconcerned. We have a huge population of deer here. I knew immediately what it was. A Bigfoot. I noted a tree limb that was even with its head. 1 step, and it was gone. I went out there and marked the limb where its head had been with a piece of white rag. The next week, on January 3rd, around 2:30 p.m., I was out in the backyard of my property with the loppers. I was cutting a trail through the thick brush so that I could get to the next street easier. There are some narrow deer trails, and I was on one of those. I smelled something really bad. It was like a ripe garbage can. I made my way in that direction, clipping the branches, when suddenly I saw something on the ground, and about 6 to 8 feet in front of me. At first, I couldn't see what it was, and then it moved. I was frozen in fear. I'm on oxygen, and I knew I couldn't run. This thing rose to its hands and knees. It was hairy and brown with a silver gray on its back. It reminded me of a giant pile of steel wool. I thought it was a bear at first. It was supporting itself on its right hand and knees. The left hand was off the ground. It turned its head and upper body and looked at me. My fear level was at a 10. I dropped my loppers without moving. He then looked away from me, shifting its weight to its left hand. He brought his right hand up in front of him and rubbed his thumb and fingers while he was looking right. then forward, as if he were reasoning out which way to go. Then he looked back at me, but his expression changed, and my fear level dropped. He looked intelligent. After a few seconds of considering what to do, he took off in the direction he was facing, straight ahead. On all fours, he slithered along the ground, going under limbs and up a little rise about 15 feet. Then I saw him stand up momentarily, and then he ducked down and darted away to the right. It was at that moment that I decided to run. To heck with the consequences. I made it back to my yard and about halfway to the house when I collapsed. After resting, getting my breath, and collecting my wits, I went back there. I found what I think is a handprint, and I placed a bucket over to preserve it. After thinking things over, that next evening, I called the police. 2 officers were there within minutes. They arrived at 6:30 p.m. They were very reassuring. They said not to worry, and to just tell them what happened, as they see strange things all the time. I told them what happened. They stayed with me for a couple of hours. They did not make fun of me, and were supportive and reassuring. A look back at Western New York Bigfoot sightings. The legend of Yeti or Bigfoot stretches back to the time before recorded history in North America, and despite many fantastic claims that eventually have been proven to be or admitted to be hoaxes, the unexplained elements of some stories are enough to capture the imagination. At least 3 times over the last several decades, Western New Yorkers have made the front page of newspapers with their claims of close brushes with ape men in the wild Batavia, Newfane, and Clarence. Batavia's Bigfoot, 1960. Batavia's Daily News was skeptical, but still ran a big photo of an 8-inch footprint left by a mystery beast under the railroad bridge of the Tonawanda Creek near Walnut Street on a summer night in 1960. Well, it wasn't a ghost, that's for sure, because it left footprints, reported the Daily News. And what tracks, 8 inches long? But if it wasn't a ghost, then what was it? As Donald Pallone, age 15, and a few of his friends crossed the bridge one night, they heard a loud, terrifying, banshee-like screech from the area of the creek below. Batavia police were joined by state troopers and following up on their tale of returning with lanterns to find a large, shadowy figure under the bridge. It was too dark to tell what it was, young Donald told the paper, but they could tell that it was fairly large as it scrambled out into the murky water. The only evidence cops found of the beast were a few giant footprints, which were photographed by a newspaper photographer who had joined in the hunt. The skeptical excitement turned to eye-rolling when the next night someone painted similar footprints leading up to the steps of the Batavia City Hall. "Who are they trying to kid?" asked one cynic in earshot of the Daily News reporter. Newfane's Bigfoot, 1980. Peter Filicetti, a part-time Newfane police officer, had spent 4 years investigating the beast he says he first encountered while picking some corn for dinner. He didn't see it, but he saw the 3-toed footprints left behind, and he heard it. "It makes a screaming sound," he said as he lit his cigarette. "I swear it'll make every hair on your body stand on end. It sounds just like a woman being murdered. It's terrible." On March 3, 1980, the above-the-banner headline in the Courier Express read, "Officer has photos of Niagara County beast," with the story headlined, "Bigfoot?" It's supposed to be between 5 foot 6 inches and 6 feet tall and weighs between 300 and 350 pounds. "I hesitate to call it a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch. I just don't know really what to call it," Filicetti told the Courier Express. The photos were of animal remains found by hunters. Dogs later ran off with a rotting head and feet of some creature, possibly a large fanged bear. But Filicetti was convinced he photographed the remains of a creature that had been spotted around Lewiston for the 2 previous decades. At a forum where the facts of the case were discussed, UB professor Paul Kurtz called the whole thing pure fantasy, guessing the remains were those of an illegally poached bear. But a West Coast Sasquatch expert in attendance wasn't so sure. At a meeting in the Village Fire Hall, John Eric Bechard, director of the Seattle-based Project Bigfoot, offered up a jar of glop, which he said just might contain hair and skin from the creature. "There's no reason why you can't have Bigfoots in western New York," said Bechard. 60% of New York State is woods or secluded off-limit areas like military bases, Love Canal, and chemical companies. "All I know is that there have been a lot of new spotlights added into the backyards at homes in the town over the past 3 or 4 years," said Filicetti in 1980. "People in Lewiston know there's something out there. A lot of them have seen it, or heard it. Clarence's Bigfoot, 2006. Mackie Becker's article in the news caused an international stir. She reported it was likely a jokester in a monkey suit, but also that Hans Mobius swears up and down that he saw and photographed a bizarre beast covered from head to toe with dark hair that walked on two legs near a patch of dense woods on his 100-acre horse farm in Clarence. I don't want to come across as a nutcase here, Mobius said, as he explained that he was going to a remote part of his 100-acre farm to photograph an area that he wanted to clear, only to come across what he said was a confused-looking creature that zigzagged as it loped into the forest. Jeff Meldrum, an assistant biological sciences professor at Idaho State University, barely looked at the photo before telling Becker it was a fake. "It's obviously a man in a suit," said Meldrum. "Look at the forearms. There's not natural taper at the wrist. It looks like a sleeve transitioning into a glove." Still, weeks later, a 7-person investigative team came to Clarence from California and used thermal imaging to catch a 6 to 8 foot tall humanoid creature in the woods. The crew from Searching for Bigfoot Inc. also made claims of having communicated with the beast using tree knocking, which they described as the preferred method of Bigfoot communication. The final word on the Mobius sighting, however, likely goes to the clerk at the longtime Buffalo costume retailer George & Company, who admitted to selling a gorilla suit only weeks before the incident. That same clerk also positively identified Mobius as the buyer.